Hello, welcome to A Bit Lit. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Nora. I call myself a fake early modernist.
Brilliant.
Because I love early modern drama. I love early modern literature, but I'm not as kind of up on the historical side of it. But I look at it kind of in the present moment, in the way that it gets used today. So I kind of have an understanding of the historical side. I sort of you could say I was trained as a theater historian, but I think about and wonder about stuff that's happening with old stuff in the present more than I kind of dive back into the past. So I call myself a fake early modernist.
That's really
And
interesting.
one of the ways thanks. It's sort of a cop out, right?
Well, it allows
I
you to
get to
have a
hang out
foot
with
in
all the
both
cool early
camps. Yeah,
I get to hang out with the cool people on both sides, but I don't have to commit.
excellent. What was it that first seduced you away from the early modern into the early modern now? Was there a particular moment or production or something?
I think it was more the other way around, actually, because I started wanting to be an actor, and so I went to school, as you do, and I kind of got excited about Shakespeare in my second year of my school, taking a Shakespeare acting class, and I felt like I was better at it than the more contemporary stuff, and really enjoyed cooking with the language and getting to kind of dig in to an older text and to kind of try and understand a historical place and time. And so I kind of went the other direction,
I
started
see.
in a kind of contemporary place, and then got seduced by the early modern.
Amazing, got pulled back in time.
Yeah.
And does that fact that you started from a kind of almost practical theatrical perspective, does that inform the way you do more practice-based things now?
Yeah, definitely. Like I like to say that I speak both languages. Like I can hold my own in an academic setting, but I also can walk into a rehearsal room and feel very comfortable there. And I feel very lucky in that, because I think a lot of academics feel very intimidated by theater professionals, and vice versa as well. And so there's a sort of there's something nice about being able to do both, and to be in a position in my career where I get to have the best of both, and I don't feel like I have to choose anymore. Because for a
Yeah.
long time I really felt like I had to kind of be one or the other. And yeah, finally, and particularly with the Measure for Measure project, I get to kind of choose my own destiny, if you will.
Wonderful. Like choose your own adventure, but where you're kind of
Yeah.
jumping between two. So could you say a bit more about the Measure for Measure project?
Yeah, sure. So that is I call it my long-term practices research project. It's kind of, it'll be 5 years old this spring. Which is crazy.
Congratulations, happy birthday.
Just going so it started from, I was actually watching the Cheek by Jowl Measure for Measure, which is in Russian, and they have surtitles, so like the English is projected over the stage. And I always say, like, I think I noticed certain lines differently because I was hearing them in a foreign to me language and seeing them projected in English, and just making, I don't know, different neural connections or something. But I was watching that on my laptop, and at the same time I was reading an article about Emma Solkowitz, who was a undergraduate student at Columbia University in New York, most famous for her senior thesis project, which was a performance art piece called Carry That Weight. And she carried her mattress around Columbia for months to protest the university's handling of her Title IX case, which in the States is the legislation that governs sexual misconduct on university campuses. So she had been sexually assaulted by a fellow student in her dorm room, and so she carried a residence hall mattress as a kind of symbol of the psychological weight she was carrying from that all over campus for several months, and she said she would carry it until she graduated or until the university took some meaningful action. And there's a very powerful image of her crossing her graduation stage in her gown with the mattress.
Wow.
That was all happening, and I was watching Measure for Measure, and I was seeing the English subtitles and hearing the Russian language, and that Cheek by Jowl production is one, and I know this is something we want to talk about, that adds a physical assault that isn't there necessarily in the script, and loads of productions of Measure for Measure do this, where there's a scene between Angelo and Isabella, and he propositions her, basically. He's sort of coercing her, right? I've been talking this spring with somebody who insists on calling that scene a seduction, and I really object to that description of that scene, because it's not.
I mean, as seductions go, have sex with me or your brother dies. Just, it isn't the most romantic or sensual.
No, and also, like, not only have sex with me or your brother dies, have sex with me or else I will kill your brother and also torture him first, because you've been so unkind to me. It's it's not a seduction, and so coercion at best.
You think so the coercion scene seems a much kind of better fit there.
So I think like seeing the lines and hearing the Russian and having Silkowitz's article open at the same time, somehow in my brain that all kind of started mixing together, and I just kept thinking, like, this play is 400 years old. And the language that Isabella uses about that experience is almost identical to the language that Emma Silkowitz uses about her experience.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Is
there a particular line there, sorry, that encapsulates that with Isabella?
To whom should I complain? Did I tell this, who would believe me?
Yeah.
Right? Like it's poetic, but it's very contemporary. You know, if somebody on the news was saying that, literally those exact words right now, we probably wouldn't think much of. We would probably go, oh yeah, that's the feeling. So yeah, it bothered me to say the least. And I know you have this experience with your work as well, where you look at something 400 years old, 300 years old, and go, what?
Yes.
How is this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So contemporary.
Because I think for me it's with domestic violence and the language we use around domestic violence and the extent to which neighbours are or aren't allowed to intervene with things that go on within the home, and it feels like we haven't interrogated that, our sense of what a home is and what's private and what we have the right to shut the doors to and what shouldn't be interfered with by the outside world. It was formed in early modern England, and we haven't looked at that and thought, do we want to change that? Is that still a helpful way of thinking about home? Right, exactly. Yeah. And so was that was the way in for you to this project, to think that this is 400 years ago and it feels too familiar. It shouldn't be that. It shouldn't be able to be transplanted from one to the other. That's concerning.
Exactly. So the kind of guiding question of the project becomes, like, everyone is always talking about how Shakespeare is so contemporary and Shakespeare is so relevant to us today, and isn't that wonderful? I don't know if it is wonderful. I think it might be awful. And you look at Taming of the Shrew, you look at Othello, you look at Titus, you look at so many of these plays, and the reason they feel contemporary is a really shitty reason.
Right.
Like, it's not good that we can all relate to Othello. It's worse if we feel we can relate to Iago. Anyone who's like, oh yeah, Petruchio, I want to be that guy. I don't know. I don't feel good about that. So it became a way to kind of to intervene in that narrative a little bit, and to say also whose voices are being prioritized. I realized in a job interview recently, someone asked me a question about it for the first time, that actually we get 2 whole soliloquies from Angelo before we get to hear Isabella really say anything.
Oh, wow. I'd never thought of that. Yeah.
So they have their first scene together, and she like absolutely trounces him, rhetorically speaking. She runs circles around him, and then it ends and he gets a soliloquy and he gets to say how hot he thinks she is. And then we get a couple of other scenes, or one other scene, and then we get another soliloquy from him being like, yeah, I still think she's hot, I'm gonna go for it, I can't even focus to pray because I'm so distracted by this hot nun. And then she comes back and we have the kind of coercion / sexual assault / definitely not a seduction scene, and then she gets a soliloquy, right?
That's
So we're
really
hearing we're seeing the whole thing through his eyes, and we know what's going to happen. Whereas she doesn't. She comes into that scene absolutely, innocently, absolutely thinking that this is a chance to save her brother.
So she's being framed entirely in terms of Angelo's, not just his desire for her, but also his sense that his question about whether he or she is to blame for the fact that he desires her, before we hear her response to that. Yeah, you're right. That's chilling. And I suppose even before that, she's framed in terms of Lucio, who is another man saying bawdy things about her while she tries to have her own thoughts and her own voice apart from that.
Exactly. And she's introduced to us as a mechanism for freeing Claudio, right? The whole story, her whole arc is about how to save her brother. It's not, it's almost nothing to do with her. She just is a tool for how that happens, right? So yeah, I kind of wanted to find out what would this story, if it actually was her story, and what would change, and what would we maybe leave out or do more of or see more of. There's a scene, there's a kind of missing scene, not a scene that Shakespeare wrote that is no longer in it, but a scene that I am curious about and want to know about, where she has to go back to Angelo to get the keys to his garden house to set up the bed trick.
Oh yes, of course. Right? Yeah.
They have this horrific scene. She gets her soliloquy, she goes to the prison, she has the scene with Claudio, which is also very emotional and very difficult, and then she meets up with the Duke in disguise as the friar, and he sets up the whole bed trick thing, and then at the end of that scene he goes, oh yeah, you better go get the keys and tell him that it's on.
Yes.
And when you stage a sexual assault in the coercion scene, that has enormous implications for what happens in that missing scene, right?
Absolutely. That if Isabella suffered that, she then has to go back to Angelo, be vulnerable with him, and set up a sexual encounter with the man who's just attacked her. Yeah.
Right. And there's every chance that he might attack her again.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. And is finding the missing scene, is that part of the practice-based work you do around this, or do you take a slightly different approach?
I take a slightly different approach. I think partly because what I am scared of with this project every time I run it is ending up kind of sensationalizing the violence, or ending up kind of in a place where we're exploring it to the extent that we're glorifying it, or we're kind of sitting in it too long. So it becomes more about her journey through it, and what happens around it, and the way that different characters look different to us when we're seeing them through Isabella's eyes, as opposed to through the Duke's or Angelo's or Lucio's or Claudio's or any of the other many men.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's sort of, I mean, not dissimilar to some of the stuff that you do. I'm thinking about your project with Lucy and the court transcripts.
Right. Yeah, where we stage court transcripts to try and access women's voices that are otherwise sort of lost from narratives, by hearing women who've suffered trauma kind of say things in their own words.
Yeah. So it's sort of about letting Isabella speak for herself in some ways, and defining her voice sort of very broadly, but also very specifically as the voices of the women in the room, right? So, and every time we run the project, it becomes very much about what does this community, what does this group need and want, and what are we prioritizing for the people who are in this room right now. So it's never the same twice, which makes it very challenging to write about. But I think that hopefully more meaningful for the people who do get to engage with it, because it's an intervention in Shakespeare, right? It's sort of going, we in this room are exactly as worthy of telling this story and of engaging with these characters in the language as Shakespeare was, if not more so. So why not? Why not, as one group of students did, why not put some Beyonce in it? You know, why not use Margaret Atwood in it? Why not, you know, pull on cultural touchstones that make sense to us and to this group? And depending on the age of the group, that's always slightly different. But you know, make it meaningful for the people who are here, right? Rather than trying to maintain some sense of loyalty to someone who's been dead for 400 years and who never really spoke for us anyway.
Yes. Yeah, that's so exciting. So you're simultaneously bringing the women in the room, you're bringing their voices kind of indirectly into conversation with Shakespeare, but you're also allowing them to use other women in popular culture, literary women, to sort of speak back and forth with Shakespeare as well.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I say the rule is that the only thing you can't add is stuff by other white guys, right? Like,
Right.
see, you can add anything you want. That anyone in the group can write anything new to add to it if they want to. And we've had poets involved, we've had musicians involved, we've had people who've created project. But when I first started working on it, it was interesting to me that my impulse was to reach for Middleton plays or Webster plays, Ord plays, or you know, all these other early modernists who deal with similar issues.
And putting
And I
Shakespeare
thought of
kind of in conversation with his contemporary.
yeah, like the courtroom speech from The White Devil was one that I was like, all right, that's going in it. And then I sort of thought, wait a minute, John Webster also doesn't speak for me necessarily, right? And why should he? And the, you know, there's that tension, and this is, I think, well documented by people who think about contemporary performance of early modern plays, that we see these characters as the kind of quote unquote strong female leads, and actually at the time most likely they're being written as sort of negative examples, right? And they don't get you know, the way that they end tells us a lot about what the playwrights think about these behaviors that to us seem really empowered. And there is kind of a gap in that
Totally.
of 400 years. So yeah, I kind of I want to resist that impulse in myself, and I also want to resist it in participants, because I think those are the easy reaches, and it's more interesting when they have to work a little bit harder for it or look a little bit further.
Totally. So just to kind of rewind this a little bit to get, because this is all absolutely fascinating, just to get a sense of what the experience is like, either for someone who's doing this practice-based work with you, or for you. How would you sort of describe this project to someone who didn't know what practice-based research was, or who didn't have a kind of wider context for this, and you wanted to get them involved? What's your kind of summary of it?
Yeah, I think my main summary is exactly that point about it's intervening in Shakespeare, right? It's creating an opportunity, mostly younger people, so mostly kind of university age or kind of sixth form age students, to have agency over Shakespeare and to kind of reclaim this story, to say, okay, Shakespeare told it that way, and that's one way to tell this story. We have a different way that we'd like to tell the story. And they don't have to match, right? To not treat Shakespeare as this kind of pinnacle of literary genius. He writes some good stuff. You know, he's a good poet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he has to speak for us. And I think a lot of students come into the project with a I don't know, trepidation maybe about intervening in the text and in making these kind of radical changes to the dramaturgy. And by the end, what they often say is that they feel like they got to have control over something that they didn't think was theirs to control before.
That's so powerful.
Which like it's a cool thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's down to people coming into the room being willing to play and experiment, and it's, you know, it's down to the group kind of agreeing that we're experimenting in a spirit of in a spirit of intervening in a very powerful cultural narrative of Shakespeare being somebody who we should revere. And, you know, if these are the stories that he's telling, should we? And that can be an open question.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm really struck by everything you're saying, because I kind of went through a similar experience recently where I was, as part of the American Shakespeare Centre's Shakespeare New Contemporaries project, I was responding to Cymbeline and writing a new play responding to that. And I was drawing on a real church court record, but where the voice of it, and it's about a rape, but the voice of the woman is entirely lost. We just have this, you know, very, very brief record, and using that as a jumping off point for a new play structured around an imaginary church court where lots of women are they're testifying against this other woman in the court, but therefore it's kind of almost a female chorus of women trying to tell another woman's story. And both the fact that it was directly in conversation with Cymbeline, so I was kind of talking back to Shakespeare, and also the fact that there were just, even though, you know, obviously not all the women were being portrayed as allies of another woman, just the fact that there were all these difficult, complex female characters all on stage, all getting to tell the story, in contrast to the kinds of things you were pulling out about Measure for Measure and who gets to speak when. It felt incredibly sort of scary and exciting to be able to think, yeah, I can put these imaginary women from my head in conversation with Shakespeare and he can speak back to them. And I think you're right, there's something there about cultural ownership and about being able to say, these are my stories too, and also, yeah, as you said, I have the right to speak back to and engage with Shakespeare.
Yeah, and you do. And like Cymbeline too, right? Think about all the men who get to tell stories about Imogen before we really hear anything from her. Before, you know, that creepy bedroom scene with what's his face, the guides in the trunk,
with Giacomo.
With Giacomo. Like, that shouldn't be allowed. That shouldn't be allowed to happen. Or if it's going to happen, there needs to be some amount of commentary on it, some kind of, you know, I don't feel like Imogen really gets an opportunity to to say that's a violating, creepy thing to do to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the fact that I suppose how complicit the audience is made in some of these acts. So if Giacomo's hiding in a trunk in order to spy on Imogen sleeping, and we, the audience, are also watching Imogen sleeping because we, like Giacomo, are kind of hiding in her bedchamber, there's that sense of, we're with Giacomo rather than with Imogen.
And I love what you're saying about there being opportunities in your play for there to be different kinds of women on stage all at the same time. I feel like that's something we still so rarely get in theater, in film, in media of all kinds. We're not really allowed to have genuinely complex, genuinely human female characters, or at least not more than one.
Right, yes, exactly.
Like if we have one, that's enough. You're done now.
Yes, and tick that box.
It's one of the things that we, like in the Measure project, we try to address that through role sharing. So because like one of the things you always hear about sexual violence cases is like, well, what was she wearing, and was she drunk, and what, you know, all these like sort of excuses that people make for rapists, which is a larger cultural question that we probably don't have time to get onto. But what we do in the project is that we kind of cast all the women, and women defined very, very broadly, by the way, right? Like the most inclusive possible definition of women, all play Isabella, either in chorus or in pairs or individually, or all of the above. But there's not one Isabella, right? So we don't get the opportunity to say, oh yeah, you know, look at what she's wearing, or oh yeah, but she was asking for it, or whatever, because we have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different representations of that same character and of that same journey, which kind of both sort of precludes, I think, some of the audience easy reaches, right? Those auto reactions, but also allows the actors to kind of say, okay, well, I'm playing this my way, and Lily's playing it her way, and we get to see how differently people navigate the same set of circumstances, and we get to see that play out in front of us and allow for that complexity.
That's so exciting. And so how does working on this project that has this kind of this openness to allowing all this complexity of different personal responses to this particular text, I know that it's informed the way you think about how theatres are staging early modern plays today. Could you say a bit more about that and about the sort of leap between the two for you?
Yeah. So I think, and this is my book project. I guess this is like, it's kind of new. I've sort of pivoted to thinking about this as an academic project quite recently. But I'm thinking a lot about the way that Shakespeare and canonical writers get away with stuff that we wouldn't necessarily let a contemporary playwright get away with, or that the conversation would be different with a contemporary playwright or with a non-canonical playwright. And I'm still kind of piecing through how I talk about it, but my thought at the moment, my kind of hypothesis for the monograph is this idea that, you know, we protect Shakespeare in a way that we wouldn't protect somebody like him who was writing plays now, right? So we have that kind of canonical status, and I think in Shakespeare's case particularly, that kind of almost godlike status. I have a good friend who's a theologian, and he and I talk about the similarities between the First Folio and the Bible all the time. Like, there are way more. There's way more in common with kind of biblical theories than you think.
I suppose even the capitalized "the bard," a little like
yes,
God, yeah, the capital
God,
letter.
my least favorite.
I feel the same.
Only one bard ever. Yeah, so just like I'm trying to think about, like, when we stage The Taming of the Shrew, what is the conversation that's happening there culturally, right? Versus when we have a new work, or we have something more recent and more contemporary. You know, when we think about, I'm trying to reach for a really current example, but like, okay, Bodyguard, right, which was on, I think it was BBC last year before. The way that the conversation around something like that, where it's new and it's current and it's kind of injecting sort of directly into current fears in the culture, and it that you know, those conversations are different, and I'm trying to work out why they're different and what's different about them and what it means that they're different, and where Othello is probably a better corollary for that, actually. But the thinking around, okay, what does it mean when we take something out of the past and put it into the present and try to pretend like nothing's different? So there's a tension there between the kind of first point that, God, yeah, that's really contemporary, nothing has changed, but also certain things have changed or should have changed, and there's a different conversation that needs to be had, and there's a different standard, I think, or a different questions that we ask of contemporary plays that we maybe gloss over a little bit when we're doing a Shakespeare, or that we sort of attribute to his godly canonical status and say, well, that's just a symptom of the times, or that's just the way it was, or, oh, but it's Shakespeare, so we can't change that, or, oh, people will understand because it's an old play. I don't think we have to do that.
Yes.
I'm kind of, I'm trying to think about when are we doing that? Why are we doing that? What does it mean when we do that? And what would it mean to not do that, or to kind of change the benchmark a little bit?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I guess that speaks to something you and I were talking about earlier, before we started recording, which was the fact that so often not only are people staging the things that are already in Shakespeare that we wouldn't maybe allow in a new play today, or we would challenge in a new play today, but also sometimes they're adding extra sexual violence. I think you used the phrase bonus rapes to try and sort of sensationalize what's going on in the play and kind of add to the misogyny.
Yeah, and to this, I mean, I curated a series for HowlRound last year, and Emer McHugh and Jess Pfeffer talked about exactly this idea that we use rape as a shorthand for lots of other things, right? That it becomes a way of saying, this person is vulnerable, or this person is mentally ill, or this person is angry or anxious, or not trustworthy, or whatever. And like, there's other ways to do that. You know,
Yeah.
we don't need to make the vulnerable bodies on stage, like, we don't need to use sexual violence, and we don't need to make those bodies into plot devices or into kind of character shorthands. It's harder to do it other ways, right? And it's kind of resisting that easy reach, but it's not necessary. Do you know what I mean? And I think a lot of the messaging that we get from theater and from media is that it's necessary, that this had to happen in order for X or Y character to have Z development.
Right.
And they don't. We really don't need it. I promise we would 100% survive as a species, as a culture, without any new sexual violence. We have enough. We could even get rid of some of the like existing old stuff in Shakespeare. We could get rid of all of it and we would be fine. We don't need rape as a species, as a culture, as a humanity. It could go away, and we would I would argue we would be better off.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that seems, I could keep talking about all of this with you for the whole rest of today, but I mean, that seems like a really powerful way and a kind of powerful statement on which to sort of begin to draw things to a close. But I wonder if we could finish with the question we're sort of asking everyone on A Bit Lit, with your response, however personal or conditional, to what is literature?
I think I like the answer that we came up with earlier, that literature is sometimes an excuse, that we can use that kind of label to ignore problematic things, or to sort of gloss over them sometimes. And once something becomes elevated to literature status, it gets a sort of gold star, and in certain ways we stop questioning it, or we stop allowing people to question it, and we sort of brush some things under the rug, that for things which are not given that exalted status as literature, we don't. And I think we could change that. That's not an inevitability. So literature is sometimes an excuse.
Lovely, great, thank you very much. And yeah, thanks so much, Nora, for taking the time to chat with me today and tell me all about your exciting research. Wonderful.
I hope we continue the conversation.
Yeah, I hope so too. Wonderful. Bye bye.